Hi, boys and girls. Today we are going to finish The Secret Garden. I'm going to be reading chapters 9 and 10. Chapter 9 is titled Magic. One of the strange things about living in the world is that it is only now and then that one is quite sure one is going to live forever and ever. It was like that with Colin when he first saw and heard and felt the springtime inside the four walls of a hidden garden. "I've seen the spring now," said Colin, "and I'm going to see the summer. I'm going to see everything grow here. I'm going to grow here myself." "That thou will," said Dickon. "Us'll have thee walking about here and digging same as other folk afore long." And it was indeed on that very day that Colin stood for the first time. He threw off the blanket covering his legs and gripped the arms of his chair. The strength that he usually threw into his tantrums rushed through him in a new way. "You can do it," Mary said over and over under her breath. Dickon held Colin's arm, then Colin's thin legs were out and his thin feet were on the grass. Colin was standing upright, as straight as an arrow and looking strangely tall, his head thrown back and his eyes flashing lightning. "I can stand," he said in a new voice. "I told thee thou could," answered Dickon. Colin drew himself up straighter than ever. "I'm going to walk to that tree," he said, pointing to one a few feet away from him. "I can rest against it if I like, and when I want to sit down, I will sit down, but not before." He walked to the tree, and though Dickon held his arms, he was wonderfully steady. "Everyone thinks I'm going to die," said Colin, leaning against the tree to catch his breath. "I'm not." "Thou die?" Dickon said. "Nothing of the sort. Thou's got too much pluck in thee. When I seed thee put thy legs on the ground in such a hurry, I knowed thou was all right." And when the sun slipped over the edge of the garden wall and ended the strange, lovely afternoon for them, there Colin stood on his 2 feet, laughing. There was magic at work in the secret garden in the months that followed. At first it seemed that green things would never cease pushing their way through the earth. Then the green things began to show buds, and the buds began to unfurl and show color. Every shade of blue, every shade of purple, every tint and hue of crimson. The seeds that Dickon and Mary had planted grew as if fairies had tended them. And the roses, rising out of the grass tangled around the tree trunks and hanging from their branches, climbing up the walls and spreading over them, with long garlands falling in cascades, they came alive day by day. Colin saw it all, watching each change as it took place. Every morning he was brought out, and every hour of each day it didn't rain he spent in the garden. Even gray days pleased him. He would lie on the grass, watching things growing. But when the sun was shining, Colin worked along with the others. "I wonder what the doctor will say when he sees how strong you are becoming," said Mary one day, as she watched Colin digging. "He won't say anything," Colin answered, "because he will not be told. This is to be the biggest secret of all. No one is to know anything about it until I have grown so strong that I can walk and run like any other boy. I shall come here every day in my chair, and I shall be taken back in it. And then sometime when my father comes back to Misselthwaite, I shall walk into his study and say, 'Here I am. I am quite well, and I shall live to be a man.'" Colin had made himself believe that he was going to get well, and the thought that stimulated him more than any other was this imagining what his father would look like when he saw that he had a son who was as straight as other fathers' sons. Each day he did grow stronger, and each day he could walk more steadily and cover more ground. One morning Dickon showed him some exercises he had learned. Colin watched them with widening eyes. He could do a few while he was sitting down. Soon he did a few gently while he stood upon his feet. Mary began to do them also. From that time on, the exercises became a part of each day. At first the robin watched Mary and Colin anxiously, worried that their strange movements might mean that they were preparing to pounce, as cats do. But then he remembered that when he himself had been made to learn to fly by his parents, he had done much the same sort of thing. He had taken short flights of a few yards and then had been obliged to rest. So it occurred to him that this boy was learning to fly, or rather to walk. And it seemed to be no time at all before the boy, who had once looked so frail and awkward, was walking and running about just like his two companions. "Mary Dickon," Colin cried out one afternoon, "just look at me." Dropping his trowel, he stood upright and stretched himself to his tallest height. Color glowed on his face, and his eyes widened with joyfulness. Mary and Dickon stopped their weeding and looked at him. "Do you remember that first afternoon you brought me in here?" he added. Dickon was looking at him very hard. "Ay, that we do," he answered. Mary looked hard too, but she said nothing. "Just this minute," said Colin. "All at once I remembered it myself when I looked at my hand digging with the trowel, and I had to stand up on my feet to see if it was real. And it is real. I'm well. I'm well." "Ay, that thou art," said Dickon. "I'm well," said Colin again. "I shall live for ever and ever." And then his face took on quite a wistful expression. "I wish my father would come home," he said. "I want to tell him myself. I'm always thinking about it. I wish my father could come, see me, and my mother." "Ay, lad," said Dickon softly, "thy mother's in this here very garden, I do believe. She couldn't keep out of it. And thy father, he must come back to thee. He must." Chapter 10 is titled In the Garden. While the secret garden was coming alive, and two children were coming alive with it, there was a man wandering about the world who for 10 years had kept his mind filled with dark and heartbroken thinking. He was a tall man with a drawn, unhappy face and crooked shoulders, and his name was Archibald Craven. He traveled to the most beautiful places in Europe, though he never remained anywhere for more than a few days. He chose the quietest and remotest spots, but he was so sad and so bitter that he never took in the beauty that surrounded him. Then one day, a strange thing happened. He was in a wonderful valley in Austria, and he had been walking alone through such beauty as might have lifted any man's soul out of shadow. He had walked a long way, but it had not lifted his. At last he had felt tired and had thrown himself down to rest on a carpet of moss by a stream. The valley was very, very still. He did not know when he fell asleep, and when he began to dream, his dream was so real that he did not feel as if he were dreaming. He thought he heard someone calling. The voice seemed very far away, but he heard it as distinctly as if it had been at his very side. "Archie," he heard, and then again, sweeter and clearer than before. "Archie, Archie." "Lillis, Lillis," he answered. "Lillis, where are you?" "In the garden." The voice came back like a sound from a golden flute. "In the garden." And then the dream ended. When he awoke, a strange calm was upon him, and something more, a lightness, as if something had changed. He was remembering the dream, the real, real dream. "In the garden," he said, wondering to himself. "In the garden, but the door is locked, and the key is buried deep." He looked down at the stream that ran through the rich green moss. He saw birds come and dip their heads and drink in it, and then flick their wings and fly away. There was one lovely mass of blue forget-me-nots growing so close to the stream that its leaves were wet, and he found himself looking at them as if he had looked at such things years ago. The valley seemed to grow quieter and quieter as he sat and stared at the bright, delicate blue of the flowers. "I almost feel as if I were alive," he said in a whisper, and he passed his hand over his forehead. "I will go back to Misselthwaite." In a few days he was in Yorkshire again, and on his long railroad journey he found himself thinking of his boy as he had never thought of him in all the 10 years past. During those years he had only wished to forget him. He had not meant to be a bad father, but he had not felt like a father at all. He had supplied doctors and nurses and luxuries, but he had shrunk from the mere thought of his son and had buried himself in his own misery. He scarcely ever saw him except when the boy was asleep, and all he knew of him, or thought he knew, was that he was an invalid who demanded to be given his own way in every detail. Perhaps I have been wrong for 10 years, he said to himself. Could it be possible that I may be able to do him good? As the train whirled him through mountain passes and golden plains, a sense of peace came over him, which brought a sort of courage and hope with it. Instead of giving way to thoughts of the worst, he actually found that he was trying to believe in better things. When he arrived at the manor, he called for Mrs. Medlock at once. She came to him, somewhat excited and curious and flustered. "How is Master Colin, Medlock?" he inquired. "Well, sir," Mrs. Medlock answered, he's different in a manner of speaking." "Worse?" he suggested. "Well, you see, sir," she tried to explain, "neither the doctor nor the nurse nor me can exactly make him out." "Where is he now?" Mr. Craven asked. "He's in the garden, sir. These days he's always in the garden with Miss Mary and young Dickon, though not another human creature is allowed to go near for fear they'll look at him." Mr. Craven scarcely heard her last words. "In the garden?" he said. He turned and went out of the room. He took his way as Mary had done, through the door in the shrubbery and among the laurels and the fountain beds. He did not walk quickly, but slowly, feeling as if he were being drawn back to the place that he had so long forsaken. He knew where the door was, even though the ivy concealed it, but he could not remember exactly where the buried key lay. So he stopped and stood still, looking about him, and almost the moment after he had paused, he started and listened, asking himself as if he were walking in a dream. The ivy hung thick over the door. The key was buried under the shrubs. No human being had passed through that door for 10 lonely years. And yet, inside the garden, there were sounds. They were the sounds of running, scuffling feet, chasing around and around under the trees, of the uncontrollable laughter of children trying not to be heard. What in heaven's name was he dreaming of? What did he hear? And then the moment came when the sounds forgot to hush themselves. The feet ran faster and faster. They were nearing the garden door. There was quick, strong, young breathing and a wild outbreak of laughing shouts which could not be contained. And the door in the wall was flung wide open, the sheet of ivy swinging back, and a boy burst through it at full speed, and, without seeing the outsider, dashed into his arms. He was a tall boy and a handsome one. He was glowing with life, and his running had sent splendid color leaping to his face. He threw the thick hair back from his forehead and lifted a pair of strange gray eyes that made Mr. Craven gasp for breath. This was not what Colin had expected. He had never thought of such a meeting. And yet, to come dashing out, winning a race, perhaps it was even better. He drew himself up to his very tallest. Mary, who had been running with him, had dashed through the door too, believed that he managed to make himself look taller than he had ever looked before. "Father," he said, "I'm Colin. You can't believe it, can you? I scarcely can myself. I'm Colin." Colin put out his hand and laid it on his father's arm. Archibald Craven could not believe that this was his son, standing so tall and proud and full of life before him. His soul shook with unbelieving joy. "Take me into the garden, my boy," he said, and so the children took him in. The place was a wilderness of autumn gold and purple and violet blue and flaming scarlet. Late roses climbed and hung and clustered, and the sunshine made it look like a temple of gold. The newcomer stood silent, just as the children had when they came into its grayness. He looked around and around. "I thought it would be dead," he said. "I thought so too at first," said Mary, "but it came alive." "It was Mary who brought it to life," Dickon said. "And Dickon and Colin too," insisted Mary. "And magic," said Colin, looking with wonder first at the garden, then at the tall man who stood beside him. Then they sat down under a tree, and Colin told his father everything. "Now," he said at the end of his story, "it need not be a secret any more. I am never going to get into that chair again. I shall walk back with you, Father, to the house." When Mrs. Medlock looked out the kitchen window moments later, she threw up her hands and gave a little shriek, and every servant within hearing bolted across the servants' hall and stood looking through the window with their eyes almost starting out of their heads. Across the lawn came the master of Misselthwaite, and he looked as many of them had never seen him. And by his side, with his head up in the air and his eyes full of laughter, walked as strongly and steadily as any boy in Yorkshire, Master Colin. Well, boys and girls, I hope you have enjoyed this book. There is a movie about it. In fact, there's a new movie coming out, I believe, this summer about the Secret Garden. I'm going to give you an opportunity for an extra credit assignment. If you happen to watch the movie, you can write me a short paragraph and look at one scene in the movie and compare it to one scene that I read about in the book and tell me the similarities and differences that you notice. You can submit that to me through my email, vsmith@xeniaschools.org, and I will give you 5 points extra credit if you do that. I hope you enjoyed it, and I shall see you soon, I hope. Thank you. Bye.